like to welcome you at the OpenExpo discussion panel in the Government Track International. It's a great pleasure to have you as audience and especially the speakers, the participants of the panel here. Carl from the European Commission, Mark from Microsoft, Bob from IBM, and I think it's one of the first times that, at least in Switzerland, we have this round of people, this distinct institution represented on a panel, and especially for us as OpenExpo, it's also a great pleasure to welcome you here on the board. Now, to start the discussion, you might have read the description in the booklet. We want to talk about different issues and especially are interested in the different strategies the firms or the institutions are pursuing. And therefore, I would like to start with an opening statement of the three persons and then continue with a around 20-minute discussion among us, basically. And later on, opening the discussion for questions from the audience. We will have a microphone and you can ask questions to different representatives. We try to make this as fair as possible and as rational and a great discussion so that everyone can benefit from the insights. So first of all, I would like to know from the European Union, basically, or Commission you're representing, what is the strategy? What is your concern about open source software and open standards in general? How did it change like 5 years ago and today, and how might it look like in the future?
Well, as you know, those that have listened to me this morning, they know that I'm representing DG Competition, so we are the European antitrust regulator, and as many other institutions, the Commission also procures and decides its IT matters on a centralized level. So this is another DG that is doing that, and we have heard actually a colleague just from that DG explaining about the OSER thing and the recommendations given by the Commission to other public administrations. Can you still hear me? Yeah. How public administration should go about these matters, and I expect that something similar is being done by the Commission itself in the relevant bodies. What I would like to say a little bit is from the competition perspective on this matter, and there, of course, one issue is that the antitrust regulator as such is, of course, aware of the growing importance of open source in the last few years. We have seen that it's very important in several sectors. In some sectors, I spoke about this morning, it's actually fair to say that it's more or less the strongest competitor of proprietary software in several markets. We are aware of that, and we think that's a good thing. And we try in statements such as this, but also in our actions, to promote the level playing field that was invoked so many times already today, so that there's no preference as to the business model in related areas, be it procurement, be it other issues. That it shouldn't be just because of the rules that a different business model should not be able to compete. And as to standards, much the same applies. We are of the opinion that there could be a coexistence, or there can and already is a coexistence between FRAND or RAND-based standards and open standards that go royalty-free, whether they come from international organizations or national standardization bodies or from consortia, as they were invoked by you this morning. We think it's a good thing that there's a competition between them when they come about, and that there's also competition between those standards when it comes to selecting a standard for having a solution built for you as a company or for us as an institution.
Okay, thank you. So I hear keywords such as level playing field or equal competition. What does you as a Microsoft representative think about, like, as a dominant player, say, so in the market? What do you think about level playing field?
Well, I totally agree with Carl that competition is a good thing. That drives a lot of activity by a lot of us, and that no denying that that's a good thing. I would like to say, though, part of the, if I could start as with a bit of an opening remark, we are here, Microsoft is here as a sponsor of OpenExpo. And some people ask us why. And I just want to say we don't view open source as a bubble. We're all part of an IT industry. It's a pretty mixed industry. There's competition at all levels and in all segments, not just the ones that one player or another has a high market share in. And our approach to open source has evolved significantly. We very much participate now in many more open source activities. We interoperate. The whole industry has moved towards greater interoperability, very much part of that, including with open source. We respect the open source approach, the open source communities, the many communities. We know there's a lot of different players, there's a lot of different people, there's a lot of different licenses, but respect needs to be there among the whole industry. And then we compete with individual products. And as I said, competition is good. And when we compete with open source products, to us, in a very large extent, that's just like competing with proprietary products. We have to compete for the same customers and deliver value, and that's just the way it is in a competitive marketplace. So we understand that. We accept what Bob pointed out this morning. The world is more open every day. We understand that and see that. But we also don't see that it's heading towards, a black and white world, one or the other. It's mixed now, and it's gonna stay mixed. We're all part of that mixed environment. And the change that we've seen, the change that we as a company have experienced, is very evident in a lot of ways. I mean, I joined the company 10 years ago, and 10 years ago, we were litigating against Sun Microsystems over interoperability issues. Now we have an interoperability laboratory with Sun Microsystems. 10 years ago, we wouldn't do anything with Linux. Now I've got Linux on my laptop, along with Vista. 10 years ago, open source was just too vague, we didn't understand it. Now there's 80,000 open source applications on the Windows platform, and we think that's great. We support that, and we support a lot of open source projects that complement our business.
So basically no problem with open source anymore.
As I said, we'll compete with products, but don't mistake that as problems, okay? We don't have problems with open source as a development model, as a general approach, or openness in general. That's a good thing.
Okay, thank you. How is it for IBM? Do you have a problem with open source, or?
No. So let me start by saying two things. One, I can barely move my head with this microphone. Okay, so that person I'm not going to be able to look at. And also I'm trying not to fall off the stool, which is a little shaky, okay? So this morning I talked quite a bit, I think, about IBM strategies and views about open standards and open source. We've been involved with Linux for 10 years. We've been involved with Apache much longer than that. One of the things, and it's not a problem inside of IBM, but open source is so mainstream within the company that you don't necessarily go to any one person about open source, this, that, or whatever. We also use open source in such a way that while you might think of Linux as a particular unit, Eclipse by itself, which we started years ago, is really very important to us because of the things that are built on top of it, right? Most of the Apache projects are important to us because they're incorporated into our products. So there's nothing in Apache pretty much that we could say we compete against because it's probably included in some way. So it all comes down to, I think, striking the right balance. I mean, it's no surprise to you, IBM has traditional proprietary software. You know that. I mean, I think we're the #2 software company in the world, right? But we balance, I think, open source with traditional software very well. We're not an open source software company. We're not a proprietary software company. We're a software company, but also a hardware company and a services company and things like that as well. So the big learning experience, I think, whether you're talking about software development, whether you're talking about intellectual property policy, whether you talk about how we engage with government officials about this, is it's all striking the right balance. It's all driving competition. It's about opening up the markets. And frankly, if we are talking about government, it's realizing that there are hundreds of governments around the world and they all have slightly different views on what happens, which complicates things quite a bit. See, I'm losing this, so I better shut up. So, thank you. Okay. I feel like Madonna on a bad day, on a very bad day.
You're almost as famous as Madonna. My question after this first round of positioning statements would be, where are the differences? Basically, European Union wants to have playing level of competition. You don't see open source as a threat, and you practice open source for years. Where do you see the difference of interests?
I think one area of difference is how aggressive people are and we are in terms of supporting open source. So we will, I mentioned this morning the UK had a paper they put out several weeks ago. And I spoke with them about that. And it was about open source and was very much leveling the playing field. And the way I described it, I said we love 95% of it. And for 5%, we have some follow-up questions. Right? Because the other 5% was, well, let me say the 95% of it was very much about open source and saying value for money, right? You have to consider what makes sense for you. And the other 5% was kind of creeping into regular old software procurement policy. It wasn't so much open source, it was just kind of an interesting mix of these types of things. We believe that the debate must need to be continued. We believe that this discussion must be had. We have found sometimes people who want to squelch discussion of open source around the world say, it's done, we don't have to talk about it anymore. But the fact of the matter is most of those people don't yet fully understand the issues. And we do think it's an attempt to stop talking about it because people know about proprietary software. They know that model, they know how to buy it. They don't know enough about open source. So I would say we are very much in favor of very vigorous debate about open source and airing of the issues and proofs of concepts and seeing it really work. Across the world, I don't think we're ready to admit it's mainstream. I think it's moving that way, but there's a lot more work that has to be done. I'll play with it, it's okay.
Where do you see any differences, if there are?
Well, there's lots of differences of opinions on how to reach certain goals, a lot of commonality in what the goals are. I mean, we always are debating with people about interoperability and how it exactly gets done, but we all have the same goal of getting it done. I mean, that's just now across the board a critical business need. So, and we've got a lot of instruction from DG Comp, of course, but we've got a lot of instruction from our customers and our customer council and our interoperability customer council. And the theme there is common. But how to achieve it? Sure, there's differences. Other differences are, well, where do we promote open source the most? A lot of what we heard today, I mean, there was certainly the desktop operating system and the Office applications. A lot of focus on that as licensed software. But I heard every single government speaker today, the 4 of them except for Carl, but the other 4, spoke about software reuse of custom developed software for e-government applications that governments pay for the development of, and they pay for that. They're taking on the risk. It's not like buying licenses for packaged software where the vendor is taking on the risk of development. This is what they're paying for, and it uses up a lot more of their budgets. A lot more of their budgets than licenses for packaged software. And you heard all of them today saying, we want that to be open source. We want that to share with, we don't want to pay for it and then you, vendor, go to the next public administration and sell it again there, and then sell it again there. You keep that IP. So that's a real difference where Bob will talk a lot about, you know, Linux and open source in one space, but I don't hear IBM talk a lot about open source and software reuse in the custom e-government applications. And that's a big budget item.
Would you like to have this reuse of software?
I think it's fantastic.
Okay.
It's logical. It's not easy to do. We've supported a couple networks of public administrations, quite a few of them, that have tried to share solutions, open source or otherwise. And it's a lot of organization, a lot of effort. But in terms of the logic of it, absolutely. And is that what our customers are saying they want to do more of? Absolutely.
Yep. If I could just, practically speaking, that becomes difficult if you are building upon proprietary software. So if I do an open public bit of software here and the vendor changes the interface underneath, and I don't know how that's done, I've got a lot of work to be doing. And we've seen that over and over. So practically, most of the discussions end up being, even the laws, tend to say, well, it should go with the person who can deal with it the best afterwards. And I think in many situations, it's negotiable, right? As you talk, because some governments, some customers want that, some customers don't want that. But there are other areas as well, I mean, as it concerns public sector. I mean, one area that for a long time, when you look at research grants, so in your government, they give money to often universities and companies to go off and do interesting projects. And more often than not, those projects just die after a few years. It's great, they produce some software, it goes on the shelf. No one can use it, no one. Hey, how about open sourcing it, right? How about from the very beginning decide that this software, particularly the exploratory software, you know, is available for people to use, to advance, and so forth. So there are lots of elements within government. It's not simply procurement. You can generally ask, though, you know, where is taxpayer money being spent and what's the best use for it? That I think will continue for years as they try to figure out what the dividing line and what's most efficient.
So basically there wouldn't be any reason why Microsoft, for example, shouldn't release Office as open source software or Windows? Or
No. When we develop a packaged program and take on the risk and get for the return on investment, I mean, we have some failed programs too, but those are successful ones. But no, that's not what I'm talking about. We paid for the development of that. I'm talking about when public administrations themselves pay for custom development of applications specific for their interests. So for a tax administration or for some other particular interest, you don't buy it off the shelf. You need to develop it. And you pay a lot of money to developers to do that. And you heard today, people say, well, we pay for it. We want the intellectual property. Okay? That's what I'm talking about, the custom solutions.
But IBM, for example, released Eclipse as open source software, which
That's good.
before was proprietary software.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something in the pipeline in your company? Or?
Well, we have our own code sharing portal, CodePlex, and then between that and SourceForge, our own engineers have put out about 500 open source solutions or applications. None of them as big as Eclipse, sure, but could they become? Who knows? Could there be another application in the future? It's not out of the question. It all is about the business model and return on investment. We do believe that the proprietary business model is a good one, but we also understand that we've got to compete for people's money and attention, so open source is going to take some of those applications as well.
Okay. So from the European Union perspective, how do you see the issue? You said you can't comment on current antitrust cases, but like in general, do you think open source Linux and technologies are a safe source to invest for companies, or might it be also in danger?
You mean when they buy something?
Yeah, for example.
In that sense, investing, or in your sense?
When governments, for example, would kind of acquire.
Well, I don't see why they shouldn't be as safe as any other solution. I mean, of course, before you go out, spend a lot of taxpayers' money, you better, find out whether the solution is feasible and delivers what you want it to deliver. And then I am of the opinion, and I discussed with you previously, that is the normal thing to do. That should always have been done in that situation, and then you look what the market offers, and if there are several solutions, you have to make a decision between them. And if you consider for some reason or other that you want your product to be open, maybe just for a practical reason, that you say, okay, I agree with you totally, actually, that if you paid for a product and it's not an open source product from the beginning, but you have the code and you bought it, then nothing prevents you from open sourcing it. And maybe it's just a practical question that this, as now being much more known than before, this is just a good way to make it reusable and to make it available for others to use, because instead of inventing the 102nd open source license for public usage nobody had ever heard about. So in that sense, I think that's a good idea. But in the other, coming back to your question, I don't think there's any specific reason why the software stemming from operators following different business models is less or more secure an investment for you as a procurer than any other. I don't see that.
Well, I would like to open now the discussion for the next couple of minutes, and would like to ask the audience if you have certain issues you want to ask one of these three institutions before, and I would welcome to take over the microphone. Or firms.
Please state your name and know that you are on record.
Theo Schmidt, Wilhelm Tux. I would like to know, it's not just about software, it's also about content and standards and formats and protocols and APIs and so on. I would like to ask Microsoft, how long do you think I have to wait until the Windows Media Player will, for example, support OGG Volbis, the free audio format? I've asked this a few times and I never get an answer.
Okay, I hate to disappoint you. I'm not the person who can answer that. I really don't know on that particular point, and apologies. I can find out for you as best I can afterwards.
Okay, a little bit less technical questions maybe, although technical questions are also of interest.
Yes, of course, it's unavoidable that I have to ask a question. My favorite question, especially to the European Commission in this case, is first, the IDABC program is coming to an end, and the follow-up program ISA is right now in discussion in Europe. What is the current status, if you know this, of the European Interoperability Framework version 2? Will it be published soon or not? I hear some different opinions on that. And my second question to the round here is, when we talk about open standards, do we at least agree on some of the basic facts? And I would like to reduce it to one single fact: royalty-free licensing of intellectual property rights. In the Commission, I hear different voices. The one are talking about free and reasonable, non-discriminatory, and we all know that it is not compatible with open source. So, from your view inside the Commission, what do you think? Is royalty-free licensing for open standards becoming mandatory in Europe, or do we still have to continue this fight to make sure we can do open source?
It's becoming what?
Mandatory for open standards in EIF version 2.
Well, I think there's nothing mandatory in the draft that I have seen.
Sorry, can you just give us a little brief update?
Well, normally that would be more for my colleague that spoke previously, because he is actually working in the IWC unit that is responsible for that one. I can relate what is public knowledge. There has been a draft for the version 2 put out to public consultation last year. Lots of comments have been received. Also, as also pointed out earlier by yourself, a lot of lobbying going on around that issue, and I understand that they are currently evaluating and processing all the feedback received and working on the document. I have no idea when or what in what form this will be coming out of the institution. And as regards the second question, well, I have read the draft. I didn't see anything about Tory there, so I don't think that that's an issue that is on the table. As to the other question, what the meaning of the word open standard is, I agree with some of the previous speakers. I think you had this slide that there's lots of word games going on there. I would be more concerned about what is meant actually on the basis of it. And there, my opinion, and I think safe to say many people's opinion, is that it's certainly possible to have standards which are royalty-freely available to everybody that wants to use them. And we think, as I said earlier, that that's a good thing, and that should be, where possible, be encouraged where there's a possibility to get that done. Apart from that, see a problem there.
Anyone of you?
Yeah, sure, I could mention that. On the open standards, or royalty-free open standards question, I mean, we participate in a lot of standards. We implement thousands of them. So as users, we're very interested in royalty-free standards as well. We don't agree with mandatory royalty-free for all standards. That is just too limiting, and not only from the user perspective, but from the creator perspective. I mean, we want to see incentives for technology providers to come to standards bodies and bring their technologies. If you have mandatory royalty-free, it may be good for a lot of people, but it will discourage some intellectual property creators from bringing their technology. And all of us as users want good technology and standards. So I think we have to find that balance that Bob was talking about, not have a mandatory scheme, but certainly one that encourages participation in standards for all technology providers. And we provide, and we, like IBM, see a lot of value in just contributing technology to many standards and not charging royalties. But that's not going to be the case with every technology. And whether open source can implement it or not, that I'm really confused by, because there seems to be plenty of companies, products that are open source based, or solutions that include open source, that are still implementing royalty-based standards. So I don't understand why somebody says it can't be done.
You know, I've always wondered about your last statement.
Yeah.
And the reason is because I think what you mean, all right, and so correct me if, is that it's not the open source code that is implementing the royalty-bearing standards. There's proprietary code somewhere in the neighborhood of open source code, right, that still works. So that is, there's something about the license that allows you to link to it. But most licenses I know about,
yeah,
if you really implement that standard, and there's a patent that applies to that,
yeah,
you're in trouble.
Okay, I mean, maybe I don't have the experience of doing it, but IBM does it all the time. You deliver open source based solutions to governments, and you implement RAND-based standards. How do you do it?
Because typically, I mean, it's that companion type of situation.
So it's a mixed source solution, which is typically what this industry is all about.
Okay, but just to be clarified, we're not saying open source should go around implementing code, right, that people expect royalties on. And especially GPL. I mean, just you really want to go to jail, open source files. I think, I mean, Jan, I'm not going to repeat my 40-minute talk this morning, all right, just to be clear. But you have to start by saying standards for what, all right? So first of all, we're here, we're open source. I would argue that probably almost every one of you is a software person, right? Probably. I mean, do you have soldering irons at home that you build boards and things like this? So right away, people, software people, and I will admit I'm a software person, right? My models tend to be software and not hardware. It's a different world in hardware land, all right, in semiconductor world and things like this. So their view of standards and standard practices, they worry, for example, about things like stacking of patents. They don't want to sell you a consumer device where the royalties on all the little, sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of things, add up to more than they can charge you for. So they have some sense of what's reasonable and what they can pay for. But some of those folks are involved in hardware and software. And so when they hear open standards and they hear royalty-free, they get terrified because they think you're putting, your foot in the door. So sure, it's software today, but eventually they'll come and get us for these other things. And so a lot of those people just shut down the discussion. They say, we're not going to talk about royalty-free, RAND is wonderful, and they globalize this discussion. And so you never get to the point of being said, where is royalty-free common practice? So 2 years ago, we did 155 standards because so many of the royalty-free licenses were different. There were some in W3C, some in IETF, some in OASIS. We put one patent non-assertion over them all. If the original license was better, use it. If you like the new one better. So what we did was we gave clarity for 155 different common standards that are used on the web, on the internet, and Web 2.0, and things like that. And we'd like to see that continuation. What parts of it? What about telco? Software, right? Years ago, people would say, forget it. Forget about royalty-free. Then we got this voice over IP thing, right? Which completely disenfranchised most of the technology they were using, which was highly patented anyway. So that's starting to change, right? 2 years ago, I talked to one of the big communications companies. They were like, oh, open standards, no, we don't want to go there. And then they mentioned 90% of their products include open source. They were clearly in transition and thinking about openness, right? So we're very much in favor of royalty-free along what we call software interoperability standards. I think that definition is being pushed out every year as we go, but I think it's dangerous to make blanket statements that for both sides.
So I see often it's also a matter of definition and how specific you are on certain issues. I think
precision and definition, very much so, because you get the two extremes arguing and you just never get anything done.
One thing that this morning I found interesting in your presentation was the elements of openness, which also kind of tries to specify, to define openness. And you mentioned participation, transparency, accountability, availability, and finally the license issue. So license is just one of 5 different dimensions, so to say. How would you define openness? What is for you open standard, open source software?
Well, openness, as Bob mentioned this morning, what a great way to start a fight, right? To try and define open, but it's definitely a movement, and I'd say all the elements that Bob described are part of it. One other part that we hear from a lot of, especially government customers, is what they refer to as open architecture. And what they mean there, and I think you can all relate to what customers want. At every layer in their IT environment, whether it's software, hardware, or services, they want more than one vendor. Right? Some of them don't care whether it's open source or not. They just want competition, and they don't want the choice of at one layer to dictate the choices at other layers. They want flexibility, and they call that open architecture. Now, actually, a lot of them look at Windows, Unix, and Linux as operating systems of an open architecture. There are many choices at each layer and many vendors. Probably the last holdout that's not consistent with the open architecture theme is the mainframe. You get a mainframe operating system, you can only get a certain type of mainframe hardware. Now, that's the kind of strong dependency that really prevents some of the goals that we see in some customers. But open architecture is something that we understand, and it's not just about open source, but it is, in a sense, openness, yes.
So I guess you can't comment, but
well, I will tell you a story about standard setting, because of course companies meeting in a room discussing certain decisions that they want to take together and then writing it down and saying, oh, we will all abide to this, normally is not looked upon very positively by antitrust regulators, because often this is what you would call a cartel in many instances. And therefore there are special rules for standard setting, and those rules, many of them are actually identical to the points you read out from Bob's discussion, because these are the conditions that must be applied by standard setting organizations for them to be exempted from the antitrust oversight, or not exempted, but to be recognized as a non-cartel, as something which is good for competition and consumers, but only if they follow these. So you have to be transparent, you have to have a process, it must be open. So these are the conditions that must be fulfilled, otherwise you cannot even get an official standard. So from that point of view, I can support these points, of course.
One point I wanted to get to, that's the first one I mentioned, which is around participation. So we've been doing standards for a long time. We did a lot of the web services things. One of the frustrating things about doing standards in any old organization is frequently it's a bunch of vendors sitting around, right? It's sometimes very hard to get customers there, because sometimes they'll say, you guys work it out, we'll do whatever. And it's a mixed blessing. Usually it's a better situation if customers are there from the very beginning, but it's difficult. One particular customer, though, is almost always absent, and that's government people. Government people, right? So when I talk about participation, what I would very much like, because you've got software developers, you've got architects, government has to get them involved in the creation of standards. I do not believe that the government can let the market decide, because the government is such a huge driving force within the market itself. Its procurement policies, the technologies it chooses. And for some governments, it's very difficult, because it's hard to say that a particular civil servant software engineer has the right to go and donate any ideas. Whose ideas are they? Who do they belong to? I think it's the same with open source. I think when you were talking about custom code, an example that came to mind is a lot of small ISVs. I mean, you can always do the models of the big companies, but many times the group that is selling the same solution to multiple government agencies is just a relatively small company of 15 or 20 people, right? They might have problems, and what governments are saying is, we want to get our people writing that code. We might want one region to get together with another region. In the US, several states to get together. Sometimes they're just not allowed to. So in that regard, as it concerns participation and government, I think cleaning up your own house and getting involved would be a very good thing.
I hear your arguments, but of course you must also see that there's a certain wariness by public bodies in general, and especially by ours, as not to be seen as, you know, influencing unduly what the market decides, and especially not to pick winners, which is the tag that's often applied to description of a situation like that. So imagine somebody sitting there saying, okay, you know what, we were going to buy next year something based on this, and this happens to be your technology or your technology. I don't want to see the press about that. So I think there one has to be very careful, and it's not the case that the public bodies are not involved in standard setting. For example, I know in Germany that the federal government is actually represented in all the committees that are discussing these things. Whether actually people are showing up there and what their input is, of course, that depends on each case. And I also see your point about the government being open about what it wants, if it actually wants to buy something. And that, I think, comes back to the EIF discussion, because there you have the governments from different countries meeting, discussing certain needs. That of course can lead at one point to a standardization, but I don't think it must be a formal involvement in the standardization itself, in the standards body at ISO, at OASIS, at the ECMA, or wherever. It's enough then if there's a clear statement of what these people want, if it's really the public bodies that discuss something.
I mean this in a nice way, but I think that's cheating a little bit.
on what?
I mean, nice. Well, it's just that you've got the engineers. You're not. Okay, number 3. Something about me today, static electricity. That is, if, in particularly with the standards, right? There are different flavors of standards organizations. National standards bodies like DIN frequently don't create standards; they bless them, right? They're different, as I said, flavors. But the ones that are really, thank you, really creating them. I mean, I think at least providing input, guidance, would be a big help, let's put it this way. And you're not picking winners with open standards because that gives you the choice of ultimately what you buy from multiple vendors.
Well, but that presupposes that in the end you will have an open standard, as I explained earlier. That is something that not the government can decide. That's what the standard setting body and the people actually meeting there decide. Those that have technology, that have maybe intellectual property rights about the material that will be covered by the standard, they will have to decide. It's not about the government telling an intellectual property rights owner that they must resign it and donate their technology to a standard. And it doesn't help if they show up. I think it gets worse if the official sits there and tells somebody that they should do that. I don't think that's how it could work in the end. I see your point. There are, of course, engineers working for the government that have ideas about this. I agree there may be sometimes a problem that they don't really know what they are allowed to say and whom their thoughts or ideas belong to formally, that they can even contribute to the one, but I think it's slightly more difficult than you seem to have in mind.
Okay, so it's a problem to work on.
Yes.
Let's leave it at that.
Okay. Okay. Any more new issues from the audience? Okay.
Hello, my name is Marcus from ETH Zurich. I have a certain interest in the question of software patenting, and I was thinking about the question for each of you because your situation is actually different. Should I ask all three at once, or you decide? Okay. The first question would be to Stefan from Microsoft. When talking about this royalty-free standards and they're being mandatory or not, you're saying you're against them being mandatory, and you argued that it would reduce the incentive of technology providers to actually enter the standards body and contribute their intellectual property and contribute actually. Well, the same argument is usually used for patents, software patents, saying this is it's an incentive, it's an instrument to give an incentive, else people would not share their knowledge or technology. So are you upholding the same argument on the software patent position for Microsoft, saying, yes, we are, and Microsoft isn't against, you are in favor because of that, because else technology innovation wouldn't be driven as much as it can be, not having these software patents?
Maybe.
Yeah, okay. Well, yes, that's correct. We think intellectual property in all forms, but patents as well, reward innovation. And patents in particular enable you to share that technology, as opposed to what often happens is people keep it as a trade secret. Okay, that is very common in our industry, and it's another form of intellectual property. But with patent protection, you actually have a systematic way to share it and license it with others.
Okay, thanks. Bob, IBM is a very interesting company in that respect, I think, because you are driving a quite, let's say, proactive strategy in the term of open source and open standards and all these things. At the same time, IBM is the biggest patent holder in the world. So what's your opinion on this tension, let's say? Will IBM decide in the long term for one of these two positions, like stronger IP or less strong IP, weaker IP? Or will you have some strategic form of, how to say, schizophrenia? Schizophrenia, because you have to balance these two extreme positions somehow?
This is what employed me for the last 4 years. in 2004, there was a task force study inside IBM because as you pointed out, for I think the last 16 years, IBM got more patents, and it's not just software patents, just patents across the board than any other company. But there was this sense that even though it was a billion-dollar business, we weren't necessarily balancing it right across all aspects of the business, because we were very much involved with open source, and we were very much involved with standards. And as you said, was this an internal contradiction? Were we confused, right? And there are lots of other sorts of know-how other than patents, right? If you do services engagements, you just learn how to do things, right? How do you protect that? What do you do with it? And so okay. We wanted to understand. We wanted to understand what we were doing, were we doing the right thing? So I was set up as part of this kind of three-way organization where we had licensing, which was responsible for $1 billion business. And it wasn't just patents, it was lots of things like this. And so they, if you will, sold things. We had the attorneys, intellectual property attorneys, who kept us honest, but also kept track of things like the new version of the GPL, when Apache would do a new license and all these things. And they had me, who when I sat at the table, they referred to as the guy who gave things away, because I did open source and standards. And they loved that, sort of. But it all boiled down to questions of understanding, saying, well, all right, let's say if our hardware division really wanted to ship an open source database, what would our software group with DB2 think of that, right? And in a company the size of IBM, which is about 400,000 people worldwide, you're just always playing these games of balancing to get total revenue, right? I mean, it's a public company, all the shareholder business and things like this. And the situation was no less true, right? And so it boiled down to understanding what did we have in our portfolio that we would give away, that we want to give away, that while we didn't control it anymore, it would make the industry better. So we might lose an advantage because we no longer had proprietary control, but we could build products that would be successful. And we had a lot of examples of that. The WebSphere application server, everything we did with Java, right? All based on standards. There are others, application servers, right? And we have to straight out compete with those things. So what we've learned through the years is not to just accept one position on software patents are good or bad. It again goes back to this issue of where are they? Where are they today? Where will they be tomorrow? Sometimes the things we do are setting up, things we give away today, if you will, are setting up the industry for you and me and everybody else 2 or 3 years from now, right? And so it's still an experiment. There is not one hard policy, but we've found that we can tune this a little bit better. We can tune it geographically because patents are very different in the US than they are in Europe. The feeling is very different. The laws are very different. We would expose ourselves to other people who might want to sue us in some parts of the world. But if we hold it and we use it in good ways for standards, we're trying to do the right thing with this balance while we and the industry are changing. So that's about the best I can say.
So there has been this recent patent pool, or you call it differently, the innovation?
Well, the Open Innovation Network was set up several years ago to essentially protect Linux, which was to buy up patents should anybody decide that they wanted to go after Linux.
Yeah.
So.
Are you considering joining this pool, protecting Linux, or?
I don't think so. The OIN, no, that's not something we're talking about joining.
Okay.
I have an application form. If you
Oh, okay. Thanks. Yeah.
One more question?
We have another question here first. Just a second. Oh.
Just a second, over there.
Okay. Yeah, we'll go to you first.
I'd like to continue.
Just a sec.
I'll repeat it, don't worry. I'm Kern Sibold, project manager for Bacula Systems, or for Bacula, and its open source backup program. I've worked in universities, in private industry, and in open source, so I've seen all ends of them. I believe we can coexist, and I applaud the efforts that IBM is making in the areas of patents. It's a difficult subject. However, on the other hand, carrying on what you said, I have to say, I have a hard time believing Microsoft is a friend of open source when at the same time you say that, there are 242 patent violations in Linux and we don't even know what they are. So really, if you want to play with open source, you've got to come clean and play on a fair level. And if you accuse us of violating your patents, which could very well be true, I won't argue that, you've got to at least come up front with us and tell us which ones they are. And then maybe what you're saying, that you're leaning toward open source, will make a lot more sense to us. Right now, it's really hard to believe what you're saying.
Okay, well, thanks. And I appreciate that, and I think what you're focusing in on, you know, Microsoft's business and the good parts about IBM's patent approach, but we both companies have a pretty mixed approach with different products and different segments. Now, we've made it clear, say 6 years ago, that we would not use our patents for exclusive purposes. We are willing to license them, to share them with anybody. And we don't, you know, our competitors are not just open source or just proprietary. They're mixed. Now, we license in patents from a lot of patent holders in order to sell our products. We can't invest in patents and then just let all of them be free. But we are willing to license them to anybody. But let me ask you, what's better? This approach where we're willing to license so that a competitor or any other company can use the technology, or the exclusive use of patents? Now, when IBM sued us, the maker of the open mainframe 2 or 3 years ago, they did it based on patent infringement, and their purpose was to stop the production. Now, that's exclusive use of patents, and it's their business interest. That's where they wanted to go with that segment. That's up to them to decide. But this is, please look at the whole picture.
I don't think you understood what I said. You're speaking a whole different language. I'm not talking about the fact that you may hold patents that people are violating. I'm not talking about licensing them. That's okay. I understand that. That's part of proprietary software. That's part of commercial applications, and that's how companies survive. What I'm talking about is claiming that there are programs like Linux that violate your patents, but you're not even willing several years after to tell us what the devil they are. Now, you know, you're just...
Let me answer that direct question.
Yeah, you won't get very far until you start playing a little bit more even on that. Even, and I'm not talking about licensing and those sort of things. That we understand.
Okay. On public information about patents, there is information. Listing 240 or something, is that going to apply to everybody in every place? No. Are we willing to talk, if you want to have a serious good faith negotiation about a license? Yes, we'll disclose any that relate to you, but it will be in a discussion between us. We don't do it in the press. That's not how patent negotiations happen. That's not how they happen for IBM. It's not how they happen for Oracle. That's not how they happen for Microsoft. So do we disclose specific technologies that are relevant for specific companies in discussions, direct discussions? Yes.
Why then this number, the 242? Just out of interest. What is the sense in telling that in public?
Well, I think that gets repeated and repeated and repeated. I think it was a number that an executive had in mind at that point in time, but does that mean that's the number for all Linux distributions or all open office? No, it's not.
The general point.
And it's probably more, it's probably less. It's more in one country and less in another. So the number, you can fix in on the number. That was stated by one person at one point in time. Our approach is what I'm describing, and it doesn't matter whether it's 2 or 50 or 200.
Would you be happy had that particular executive not make that statement?
I have to be happy with my executives.
Makes sense to me.
So I have to catch a train and I literally have to walk out the door. But we made it really easy in 2004. IBM said we would not assert necessary patents against anything in the Linux kernel. Nokia did that. I think we're going to get to a point where anyone who says they're serious about working with Linux will have to do exactly the same thing. So.
We each have different business interests and different segments we're competing in, and you use exclusive patents in other segments. I don't see a big difference.
Okay. So I'm sorry we didn't finish up in harmony, but I think we have the opportunity later on in the social event. So first of all, let me thank you very much for taking the time and also the courage to step on the panel discussion. Thank you to you. And